On February 26, 2022, just 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its European allies unleashed what they called the nuclear option in economic warfare. They expelled several major Russian banks from SWIFT. SWIFT is not a bank and does not move money itself. It is simply the secure messaging system that 11,000 financial institutions in more than 200 countries rely on to authorize cross-border payments. 45 million messages zip through it every day, underpinning $5 minus 10 trillion in daily transactions. The West was convinced this would paralyze Russia overnight. The ruble would collapse, imports would grind to a halt, and Putin would be forced to retreat or face domestic collapse. 3 years later, almost none of that happened. The ruble is now one of the best-performing currencies since 2022. Russian oil and gas keep flowing, just paid for in rupees, yuan, rubles, or even barter, and trade with China, India, Turkey, and much of the global south has exploded. Russia built effective workarounds in months, not decades. What almost no one in the West admits is that this single decision did not just fail to bring Russia to its knees, it lit a 20-year fuse under dollar dominance. The rest of the world watched in real time as a G20 economy was switched off from the global payment system for purely political reasons and realized they can do this to any of us. This is not the first time a hegemon has weaponized the world's financial plumbing and accidentally accelerated its own downfall. It has happened 4 times in the past 110 years with exactly the same pattern. The dominant power controls the key network, uses it as a weapon against a major rival. The rival suffers, but survives and builds. Alternatives, neutral countries get frightened and start hedging, and eventually the weapon and the dominant currency loses its power. We saw it with Britain and the pound after 1914, with the US against Iran in 2012 to 2018, and in smaller cases with Cuba and Iraq. Today we are living through case 5, only this time the target is Russia, the world's largest country by landmass, a top 3 energy producer, and a nuclear superpower. In record time, Russia expanded its own SPFS messaging system and linked it to China's SIPs, forced unfriendly buyers to pay for energy in rubles, shifted over 90% of its trade with China to yuan and rubles, signed bilateral payment deals with India, Turkey, Iran, the UAE and others, and stockpiled gold and yuan. From 1914 to 1944, Britain taught the world the first lesson in financial hegemony. When World War I began, London froze German assets, blacklisted neutral ships, and forced banks from New York to Buenos Aires to comply. It strangled Germany brilliantly in the short term, but every neutral trader and central banker took the same note. If you keep your wealth in pounds, Britain can seize it the moment it dislikes your politics. Over the next 30 years, the world quietly diversified into dollars, gold, anything else. By Bretton Woods in 1944, the pound's reign was finished forever. Fast forward to 1979. Iran seizes the U.S. Embassy. Carter freezes $12 billion of Iranian assets in American banks, the largest unilateral seizure in history. Washington saw justice. The rest of the planet heard a warning siren. Park your national savings in New York, and one presidential signature can erase them. OPEC and Middle Eastern countries immediately shifted billions to London, Zurich, Singapore, Deutschmarks, yen and gold. The dollar share of OPEC reserves began a slow bleed that has never stopped. The dress rehearsal came in 2014 after Crimea. The West sanctioned Russian oligarchs and banks, but left Russia inside SWIFT and the dollar system, a deliberate half measure that handed Putin an 8-year head start. Moscow dumped U.S. treasuries from $130 billion to near zero, more than doubled gold reserves, built its own payment messaging system, SPFS, and signed currency swap lines with China and India. Western experts mocked the effort until February 2022, when the West finally pulled the real trigger. Russian banks were expelled from SWIFT and dollar. $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves, politely parked in New York, Frankfurt, and Tokyo, were frozen overnight. Pundits declared the Russian economy would be rubble in weeks. Instead, 3 months later, the ruble had recovered. 6 months later, Russia ran its largest ever current account surplus. And within a year, its GDP grew faster than Germany's. The world watched in real time as a G20 economy thrived outside the dollar SWIFT system, paying for oil and wheat in yuan, rupees, and dirhams through new pipes and rails. That live demonstration was fatal to American financial hegemony. Every finance minister and central banker asked the same question. If they can do this to Russia today, what stops them from doing it to us tomorrow? The great diversification, led not by America's enemies, but by its friends and neutrals, exploded. China slashed treasury holdings by over 40% while buying record gold. Saudi Arabia began selling oil to China in yuan. India and the UAE settled billions in local currencies. More than 50 central banks now test non-dollar cross-border systems. BRICS openly discusses a commodity-backed unit. The numbers are merciless. Dollar share of global reserves fell from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024. Dollar share of international payments collapsed from approximately 73% to approximately 58% in just 2 years, the fastest drop ever recorded. The 5-act play is always identical. One currency achieves monopoly. Its issuer weaponizes access. Targets build escape hatches, neutrals hedge, and the weapon gradually loses its terror along with the dominance that created it. Britain needed 2 world wars and 30 years to fall. Thanks to digital finance and the shocking clarity of 2022, the dollar's slide is on fast forward. The monopoly privilege is already gone forever. The only question is only how many years remain until the world openly admits it. 25 years ago, roughly 60 to 62% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars. Today that number has quietly slipped below 58%, and in the last 2 years alone, it dropped 4 full points. Do the math. If the slide stays linear, we hit 45% somewhere around 2050. But the slide isn't linear anymore, it is speeding up. At the current pace of acceleration, 45% could arrive as early as 2035. That's not a distant generational shift. That's 1 or 2 decades, maybe less. And when the dollar's share of global reserve drops under the psychological 40 to 45% threshold, something breaks that can never be put back together. Right now the United States can borrow $2 trillion a year, year after year, at absurdly low rates, because the rest of the planet still needs dollars to buy oil, ship goods, and park their savings. Foreign central banks buy U.S. treasuries not because they love America, but because they need the world's reserve currency. That demand is what keeps yields low and lets Washington run perpetual deficits without immediate pain. The day that demand collapses, interest rates explode, deficits become mathematically impossible, and the American way of life, built on importing everything while exporting freshly printed paper, comes to a sudden, grinding halt. The free ride ends. So who comes out ahead when the music stops? China, first and loudest. Beijing doesn't need to fire a shot. It already has the biggest manufacturing floor on Earth, the largest trade surplus, the fastest growing cross-border payment network, CIPS, and a currency that is quietly being accepted from Jakarta to Riyadh. It has spent 2 decades stockpiling gold and building financial plumbing that works without Washington's permission. When the dollar stumbles, the renminbi doesn't have to win a war, it simply walks through the open door. Russia wins too, in a colder, harder way. Moscow took full blast of Western financial artillery in 2022 and is still standing. That single fact shattered the illusion that the dollar system is invincible. Every finance minister from Brasilia to New Delhi watched and thought, If Russia can survive being cut off from SWIFT and having $300 billion frozen, maybe we don't have to live in fear anymore. Russia turned a tactical defeat into a strategic demonstration project. The entire BRICS constellation, old members and the new ones, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, suddenly has room to breathe. They can sell oil in yuan, settle trade in rupees, or just keep multiple sets of books. Middle powers gain options. Options are power. Gold wins. Central banks are buying it at the fastest clip since the early 1970s. When trust in paper erodes, people reach for the one asset no government can print. Alternative rails win. China's SIPs, Russia's SPFS, India's UPI, Brazil's PIX. Crypto bridges, anything that lets two countries trade without asking Washington for permission. And who loses? America loses the invisible subsidy that has underpinned its global primacy for 80 years. No more borrowing without limit. No more weaponizing the dollar and watching the world obey. The military-industrial complex becomes unaffordable the moment bond markets demand real interest rates. Living standards don't collapse overnight, but they deflate steadily as imports get pricier and real wages shrink. America becomes a normal great power, still rich, still strong, but no longer able to write checks the rest of the planet is forced to cash. Europe loses by attachment. The old continent chained itself to the dollar system, froze Russian assets, and followed Washington's sanctions playbook. The euro never stepped up as a serious rival reserve currency because Brussels was too busy being a loyal deputy. When the dollar wobbles, the euro wobbles with it, and the yuan walks past both. SWIFT itself, the quiet Belgian cooperative that became the nervous system of global finance, loses its monopoly. It won't vanish, but it will shrink into just one of several competing messaging networks, its transaction fee revenue bleeding away to Shanghai and Moscow. Anyone holding large piles of dollar assets, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, wealthy families watches their wealth melt in slow motion as the currency loses 6 to 8% purchasing power a year, every year, while treasury yields can't keep up. Capital flight accelerates the decline. American consumers lose the 50-year discount they've enjoyed on everything from televisions to gasoline. The trade deficits don't disappear by magic. They have to be paid for with real exports or real austerity. Either way, Walmart shelves get more expensive, fast. The ironic part? The fatal blow wasn't delivered by a Chinese aircraft carrier or a Russian hypersonic missile. It was delivered by the United States itself in the spring of 2022, when it reached for what looked like the ultimate financial weapon, freezing half of Russia's reserves and kicking its banks out of SWIFT. That moment felt like peak American power. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. Financial weapons, like nuclear weapons, have a strange property. The first use them once at full scale, and you teach the entire world to build deterrence. Russia built them. China accelerated its own. BRICS expanded. Petrodollar deals started being signed in renminbi. The defenses are now in place. History rhymes. Britain weaponized sterling finance against enemies before and during World War I. 30 years later, the pound was finished as the world's reserve currency. The United States weaponized the dollar system in 2022. The pattern suggests the dollar's days as unquestioned king are numbered, probably measured in the 2030s, possibly earlier. This isn't about hope or fear. It's about incentives and arithmetic. Once the rest of the world realizes it no longer has to hold dollars to survive, it stops holding dollars. Once it stops holding dollars, America can no longer borrow trillions without consequence. Once that happens, the post-1945 American era is over, not with tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue, but with a slow, inexorable rebalancing of global wealth and power. The trigger was pulled in February 2022. The bullet is still traveling. In 10 or 20 years, historians will point to that month and say, that's when the dollar's reign quietly began to die, not because China's victory, America's self-inflicted wound. The post-dollar world isn't science fiction. It's already under construction, transaction by transaction, gold bar by gold bar, alternative pipe by alternative pipe. And the architect of its arrival wasn't Beijing or Moscow. It was Washington.